In this direct answers video, we're going to talk about the 23 reporting company exemptions under the Corporate Transparency Act. Now, in most cases, if your company qualifies as a reporting company, you're going to have to report your information to FinCEN. But if your company meets one of these 23 exemptions, then you'll be exempt from reporting. 23 is a lot of exemptions. So to make it easier for you, I've grouped them into 7 different groupings to make it easier for you to understand what types of exemptions there are. Now, maybe you can use this video to put your baby to sleep. If that's the case, then be my guest. But it's important to pay attention right now, because the first grouping is the most common types of exemptions that you'll hear about. And the most important exemption in this grouping is the large operating companies exemption. And with this exemption, there are 3 requirements that you need to meet in order to qualify as a large operating company. Number 1, you must employ more than 20 full-time employees. Now, I should mention that these employees must be employed in the US. And on top of that, they must work more than 30 hours in a week or 130 hours in a given month. Second, your company must have more than $5 million in gross receipts on a federal tax return. And the types of tax forms that can be used to calculate this $5 million figure are Forms 1120, 1120S, and Form 1065. And this can also include a consolidated tax return for 2 or more entities. And when you calculate this $5 million figure, you must exclude gross sales or receipts that come from outside of the US. And on top of this, if you anticipate that you're going to make $5 million in gross receipts, you can't prove it. So in that case, you'll need to still report your information to FinCEN. And number 3, your company must have a physical office that's located inside the US. So, if your company either owns or leases office space for the company itself, then you'll meet this requirement. But if your company works out of a shared space, or your company works entirely remotely, then you won't qualify for this exemption. And if you meet all 3 of these requirements, your company won't need to report their information to FinCEN. But if you fall beneath them, then most likely you're going to have to report your info. The second most common exemption is the inactive entities exemption. And under this exemption, you must meet 6 requirements. Number 1, your entity was in existence before January 1st, 2020. Number 2, you're not engaged in any active business. Number 3, ownership is not held directly or indirectly by a foreign person, so all people must be US residents. Number 4, there can't have been a change in ownership in the preceding 12-month period. Number 5, the company has not sent or received funds in the last 12-month period before you report your information. And number 6, your company does not hold any type of assets. So if you meet these 6 requirements, your company will be exempt from reporting your information to FinCEN. And the third most common type of exemption is subsidiaries of exempt entities. And this is where you have ownership interests that are owned and controlled either directly or indirectly by one or more exempt entities. The entity must also be owned entirely by other exempt entities. So if an entity is partially owned by a non-exempt entity, then that entity must still report information to FinCEN. This was a little bit complex, so I'll simplify it for you. If you have a holding company that's an exempt entity under the CTA, and that company owns 100% of the interest of a company beneath it, then the company beneath it won't have to report any information to FinCEN. The second grouping of exempt entities relates to taxes. So there's a few different types of tax-exempt entities that apply here. The first is an entity that's described in Section 501C and is exempt from tax under Section 501A. The second type is a political organization that's defined in Section 527E1 and is exempt from tax under Section 527A. And the third type of entity is a trust that's described in Section 4947A. One of the things I should mention here is that many homeowners associations do not qualify for this tax-exempt exemption. This is because many HOA boards file under Section 528 of the tax code. And because it's under 528 and it doesn't meet any of the other exemptions, if you are on the board of a homeowners association, you're still going to need to report your information to FinCEN. And the second type of exemption under this grouping are entities that are assisting tax-exempt entities. And there are a few requirements that you need to meet to make this exemption. The first is that the entity operates exclusively to provide financial assistance to or hold governance rights over a tax-exempt entity. The second is that the entity must be owned by a U.S. person. The third is that the entity is beneficially owned or exclusively controlled by a U.S. citizen, or they're lawfully admitted for permanent residence. And lastly, it derives at least a majority of its funding for one or more U.S. persons that are U.S. citizens, or they're lawfully admitted for permanent residence. So, pretty much, if it's an entity that provides assistance to a tax-exempt entity, and that entity's owned by U.S. persons, then you'll be exempt from reporting your information to FinCEN. The third grouping of exempt entities relates to securities, or any entity that's registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And the first type of exemption here is for pooled investment vehicles. And there's a few things that need to be met before you can meet this exemption. The first is that the entity must be a pooled investment vehicle under the Investment Company Act of 1940, or it would be an investment company and identified by its legal name with the SEC. The second is that the entity is owned or operated from one of these exempt entities below. They can be banks, credit unions, brokers or dealers in securities, investment companies or investment advisors, or they could be venture capital fund advisors. And lastly, the entity must be a U.S. entity. If the entity is foreign, then they must report beneficial ownership information to FinCEN. And the second exemption under this grouping is for registered investment companies and investment advisors. And there are two requirements that need to be met here. The first is that the entity must be an investment company or an investment advisor that's defined in either the Investment Company Act of 1940 or the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. And second, the entity must be registered with the SEC. If the entity doesn't meet these two requirements, it's not exempt and it must report its info to FinCEN. Under this grouping, there's also 5 other exemptions that I'll briefly mention. The first is securities reporting issuers. The second is brokers or dealers in securities. The third is securities exchange or clearing agencies. The fourth is venture capital fund advisors. And the fifth one is the catch-all. This is any entity that's an other entity that's registered under the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934. And for this exemption, there's 2 requirements. The first is that it's any entity that's registered with the SEC. And the second is that it doesn't meet the requirements of the other exemptions. So pretty much, if you're an entity that's registered with the SEC, most likely, you're not going to have to report your information to FinCEN. And the reason being is that the SEC is already regulating you. And the fourth grouping of exemptions relates to insurance. The first exemption here is an insurance company. And the second is any state-licensed insurance producers. And in order to be a state-licensed insurance producer, there are 2 requirements that you must meet. Number 1, the entity is an insurance producer that's authorized by the state and subject to supervision by the insurance commissioner. And second, the entity has an operating presence at a physical office in the U.S. And the fifth grouping of exemptions relates to banking. And under this grouping, there's 4 exemptions that apply. The first is banks, The second is domestic credit unions. The third is depository institution holding companies. And the fourth is a money transmitting business. The thing with money transmitting businesses is that if you are a money transmitting business, you must already register with FinCEN. So this CTA requirement would be redundant. Now, the sixth grouping of exempt entities relates to public utilities. The first exemption is public utilities themselves. And in order to be a public utility, you must first be a registered public utility, and second, you must provide electrical power, natural gas, water, sewer, and other telecommunications services somewhere in the US. And the second exemption under this grouping is financial market utilities. Now, the seventh and final grouping is a miscellaneous grouping. The first exemption under this grouping is a governmental authority. And in order to be a governmental authority, you must meet two requirements. Number one, it's an entity that's established under federal, state, tribal, or local law, or it's an interstate compact between two states. And the second entity under this grouping is a Commodity Exchange Act registered entity. And there are two requirements that need to be met here. Number one, the entity is a registered entity under the Commodity Exchange Act. And second, the entity is a futures commission merchant, introducing broker, swap dealer, major swap participant, commodity pool operator, commodity trading advisor, or a retail foreign exchange dealer. And last but not least, the third exemption is for public accounting firms. Well, I'm really surprised you made it this far. Those were the 23 reporting company exemptions under the Corporate Transparency Act. And if your company meets one of those 23 exemptions, you won't have to report your information to FinCEN. Hold on, I'm not done yet. If you're looking to start a business, click the link in the description below and schedule a free 15-minute consultation with us. Also, make sure to check out the Corporate Direct website and subscribe to our newsletter, where we'll send you a lot of good information on corporate law amongst other things. And as always, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you have any general questions about anything. I'll see you next time.